The searing pain of a red-hot iron pressing into her skin changed everything for young Sarah. But what she did next would shatter the foundations of a Southern empire and free over 100 souls. In a world where slaves were branded like livestock, one woman's calculated revenge turned her tormentor into her husband and his fortune into a weapon for liberation. You won't believe how she pulled off the ultimate long-game payback that scandalized the nation. Stay tuned, because this story of survival, strategy, and sweet vengeance will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about power and resistance in America's darkest chapter. The iron was white-hot when Master Jonathan Harrington pressed it into my shoulder, and the smell of my own flesh burning is something I've never forgotten. I was 17 years old, and I'd been caught for miles from the plantation, running toward a freedom I would never reach. They brought me back in chains, and Master Harrington decided to make an example of me, to ensure that I would carry the mark of my disobedience for the rest of my life. "Hold her down," he ordered, and 4 men pinned me to the ground while he heated the branding iron in the fire. It was his personal mark, the letter H for Harrington, the same mark he used on his cattle and his horses, the same mark he would now use on me. I didn't scream when the iron touched my skin. I bit through my lip to keep silent, tasted blood, and stared up at the sky while my shoulder burned, and the men holding me down turned their faces away from the sight and the smell. I wouldn't give Master Harrington the satisfaction of hearing me scream. But I couldn't stop the tears that ran down my face, couldn't stop my body from convulsing with agony, couldn't stop the part of my mind that broke in that moment and reformed into something harder, colder, more determined than it had been before. My name is Sarah, and that day in 1842, when I was 17 years old and Master Jonathan Harrington burned his mark into my flesh, I made a promise to myself. I would survive, I would endure, and someday, somehow, I would make him pay for what he'd done to me. I just didn't know it would take 10 years, or that my revenge would come in a form I never could have imagined. Master Harrington was 35 years old when he branded me, a widower whose first wife had died in childbirth along with their infant son. He was considered handsome by the standards of Virginia Plantation society. Tall with dark hair and sharp features, educated at the University of Virginia, heir to one of the largest cotton plantations in the state. He was also cruel in the casual, thoughtless way that men of his class often were, treating slaves as property to be used and discarded without consideration for their humanity. But something changed after he branded me. I noticed it in the weeks that followed, as my shoulder healed into an ugly, raised scar that would mark me forever. He watched me differently, his eyes following me as I worked in the fields, as I carried water. As I moved through the daily routines of plantation life, there was something in his gaze that made my skin crawl, something that was worse than simple cruelty, because it was personal, focused, obsessive. I was beautiful. I knew that, had known it since I was old enough to understand what beauty meant and how dangerous it could be for a slave woman. I had my mother's high cheekbones and dark eyes, my father's height and strong build. My skin was the color of polished mahogany, and my hair fell in thick waves down my back when it wasn't tied up for work. Beauty was a curse for slave women. It attracted attention we didn't want, made us targets for masters and overseers who saw us as objects for their pleasure. I'd managed to avoid that fate for 17 years through a combination of luck and my mother's fierce protection. But my mother had been sold away 2 years earlier, and now I was alone, marked, and attracting the wrong kind of attention from the man who owned me. It started with small things. Master Harrington would find excuses to speak to me, to call me to the big house for tasks that didn't need doing, to keep me close where he could watch me. He gave me better clothes, better food, privileges that the other slaves noticed and resented. And then, 6 months after he branded me, he came to my cabin in the quarters late one night and made his intentions clear. "You belong to me," he said, standing in the doorway, blocking the moonlight. "You've always belonged to me, but now I'm going to make that belonging complete." I could have fought. I could have screamed. Could have tried to run. Could have resisted in the ways that slave women sometimes resisted when faced with this particular horror. But I'd learned something in the months since my failed escape attempt. Direct resistance only brought more pain, more punishment, more suffering. If I was going to survive, if I was going to eventually get my revenge, I needed to be smarter, more strategic, more patient. So I didn't fight. I let him take what he wanted. Let him believe that I was submitting, that I was accepting my fate. And while he used my body, I went somewhere else in my mind, to a place where he couldn't reach me, where I was still myself, still free, still planning and waiting for my moment. It became a pattern over the next few years. Master Harrington would come to my cabin 2 or 3 times a week, would take his pleasure, and then leave. Sometimes giving me small gifts, a ribbon, a piece of jewelry, extra food. As if these tokens could somehow make what he was doing acceptable, could transform rape into something resembling a relationship. And I played along. I accepted the gifts. I smiled when he wanted me to smile. I pretended to be grateful for his attention because I understood something that he didn't. Every gift, every privilege, every moment of his obsession with me was a tool I could use. A weapon I could turn against him when the time was right. I also learned to read by stealing books from the big house and studying them in secret. I learned about law and property and inheritance by listening to Master Harrington's conversations with his lawyers and business associates. I learned about the world beyond the plantation by talking to traveling slaves and free black people who passed through the area. And I learned patience. The kind of deep strategic patience that comes from knowing that revenge is a dish best served cold. In 1848, when I was 23 years old, Master Harrington married again. Her name was Victoria Langley, and she was the daughter of a neighboring plantation owner. A pale, delicate woman who seemed to exist in a state of perpetual fragility. The marriage was strategic, a union of 2 powerful families, a consolidation of land and wealth and social position. I thought Master Harrington's obsession with me would end with his remarriage. I thought he would turn his attention to his new wife and leave me alone. Well, I was wrong. If anything, his visits to my cabin became more frequent, more intense, as if he were trying to prove something to himself or to me. "She's not like you," he told me one night, lying beside me in the narrow bed, his hand tracing the scar on my shoulder, the mark he'd burned into my flesh 6 years earlier. "She's weak, fragile. She doesn't have your strength, your fire. I married her because I had to, because it was expected. But you're the one I want." I said nothing. Just lay there and let him talk. Let him reveal his thoughts and feelings. Let him believe that I cared about his inner turmoil. And I filed away every word, every confession, every piece of information that might someday be useful. Victoria Harrington died in 1850, 2 years after the marriage. Of what the doctors called consumption. But what I suspected was simply the slow death of a woman who'd been trapped in a loveless marriage with a man who barely noticed her existence. She left no children, no heirs, nothing but a grave in the family cemetery, and a widower who seemed more relieved than grieved by her passing. And then, 6 months after Victoria's death, Master Harrington came to my cabin with a proposal that changed everything. "I want to marry you," he said. I stared at him, certain I'd misheard. "Sir, I want to marry you, Sarah, properly, legally, as much as the law allows. I know it's not conventional. I know it's not what society expects, but I don't care. I love you. I've loved you since the day I branded you. Since the moment I saw your strength and your defiance. I want you to be my wife." My mind raced, trying to process what he was saying, trying to understand what this meant. Marriage between a white man and a black woman was illegal in Virginia. It was illegal in every southern state. It was unthinkable, scandalous, the kind of thing that could destroy a man's reputation and social standing. But it was also an opportunity, the greatest opportunity I would ever have. "How?" I asked carefully. "How would we marry? It's against the law. I have a plan, Master Harrington said, his eyes bright with the fervor of a man who'd convinced himself that his obsession was love. There's a priest, Father Mallory, who owes me money. He's agreed to perform a private ceremony to create documentation that will hold up legally, even if it's not publicly recognized. You'll remain my housekeeper in public, but privately, legally, you'll be my wife. And when I die, you'll inherit everything, the plantation, the slaves, all of it. He thought he was offering me a gift. Thought he was demonstrating his love by elevating me from slave to wife. He thought he was erasing the past, making up for the brand on my shoulder and the years of rape and exploitation. He had no idea he was handing me the weapon I would use to destroy him. Yes, I said, keeping my voice soft and grateful, playing the role he expected. Yes, I'll marry you. Master Harrington smiled, pulled me into his arms, and kissed me with a passion that made my stomach turn. But I kissed him back. I held him close, and I began planning how I would use this marriage to take everything from him and give it to the people he'd spent his life enslaving. The ceremony took place 2 weeks later in the study of the big house late at night when no one else was present. Father Mallory was a red-faced, sweating man who reeked of whiskey and desperation, clearly uncomfortable with what he was doing, but too indebted to Master Harrington to refuse. "Do you, Jonathan Harrington, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Key mumbled, barely looking at either of us. "I do," Master Harrington said firmly, his hand gripping mine. "And do you, Sarah?" Father Mallory realized he didn't know my last name, that I didn't have a last name because slaves weren't given surnames. "Just Sarah," I said clearly. "Do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" I looked at Master Harrington, at the man who'd branded me, who'd raped me for years, who'd owned me like property, and now thought he was honoring me by making me his wife. I smiled. "I do," I said. "Father Mallory pronounced us married. Master Harrington signed the marriage certificate, and I signed it too. The first legal document I'd ever signed. The first time my name had appeared on paper as anything other than property in an inventory. And just like that, I went from being Jonathan Harrington's slave to being Jonathan Harrington's wife. Legally, secretly, impossibly. I was married to the man who'd burned his mark into my flesh 9 years earlier. He thought he'd won. He thought he'd captured me completely, had bound me to him in the most permanent way possible. He had no idea that he'd just given me everything I needed to destroy him and everything he'd built. He had no idea that the woman he'd married was already planning how to use that marriage to free every slave on his plantation and burn his legacy to the ground. The brand on my shoulder throbbed as Master Harrington. My husband pulled me into his arms that night, but I barely felt it. I was too busy calculating, planning, preparing for the moment when I would transform from victim to victor, from property to owner, from slave to the woman who would dismantle the entire system that had created us both. Jonathan Harrington had made many mistakes in his life, but marrying me was the biggest one, and he would spend the rest of his life regretting it. The morning after the wedding, I woke up in Master Harrington's bed, in the master bedroom of the big house, in sheets that cost more than most slaves would earn in a lifetime if they'd been paid for their labor. Jonathan was still asleep beside me, his arm draped possessively across my waist, and for a moment I allowed myself to feel the strangeness of it. I was lying in the bed where his first wife had died, in the room where plantation business was conducted. In the heart of the house that represented everything I'd been taught to fear and hate, but I was no longer a slave lying in her master's bed. I was a wife lying beside her husband. Legally, impossibly, secretly, but undeniably, I was Mrs. Jonathan Harrington. The irony was almost enough to make me laugh. I slipped out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake him, and dressed in the simple clothes that had been laid out for me. Not the rough slave clothing I'd worn for 25 years, but the plain but respectable dress of a housekeeper. That was to be my public role, the fiction that would allow Jonathan to keep me close without arousing too much suspicion. Sarah, the trusted housekeeper who managed the big house and attended to the master's needs. No one would know I was his wife. No one could know because interracial marriage was illegal in Virginia, punishable by imprisonment and social destruction. The marriage certificate was hidden in Jonathan's safe along with other documents he considered too valuable or too dangerous to leave lying around. But I knew where that safe was, and I knew, because I'd watched him open it dozens of times, what the combination was. Over the next few weeks, I settled into my new role with careful precision. Publicly, I was the housekeeper. I managed the household slaves, oversaw the cooking and cleaning, handled the day-to-day operations of the big house. The other slaves resented my elevation, saw it as favoritism, or worse, whispered that I'd sold myself to the master for privileges and comfort. They weren't entirely wrong, but they didn't understand that every privilege, every moment of access, every piece of trust that Jonathan gave me was a tool I was collecting, a weapon I was sharpening for the day when I would use it against him. Privately, in the evenings, when the house was quiet and the slaves had returned to their quarters, I was Jonathan's wife. We ate dinner together in the dining room. We sat together in the parlor, him reading his newspapers while I pretended to do needlework. We slept in the same bed, and he treated me with a tenderness that might have been touching if it weren't built on a foundation of ownership and violence. "I love you," he told me one night, his fingers tracing the scar on my shoulder, the brand he'd burned into my flesh, the mark of his ownership that he now seemed to view as some kind of romantic symbol. "I know I hurt you when I did this. I know I was cruel, but I was young. I was angry. I didn't understand what you meant to me. Can you forgive me?" "Of course," I said, keeping my voice soft and loving, playing the role of the devoted wife. "That's in the past. We're different people now." He smiled, relieved, and pulled me closer. And I let him hold me, let him believe that his love had somehow erased the years of rape and brutality, that marriage had transformed our relationship into something consensual and equal. But while he slept, I was working. I had access to everything now, to his study, his papers, his correspondence, his financial records. I spent my days managing the household, but I spent my nights educating myself, learning everything I could about Jonathan's business, his debts, his assets, his legal vulnerabilities. I learned that the plantation was worth approximately $250,000, a staggering sum that included the land, the buildings, the equipment, and the 132 slaves who worked the cotton fields. I learned that Jonathan had debts totaling nearly $60,000 owed to various creditors and banks. I learned that his will, written after Victoria's death, left everything to his cousin Edmund, with no provision for me. Because at the time I'd been property, not a person who could inherit. But now I was his wife. And under Virginia law, a wife was entitled to at least 1/3 of her husband's estate. Sometimes more, depending on the circumstances. Of course, that law assumed the wife was white. It assumed the marriage was legal and public. It assumed a lot of things that didn't apply to my situation. But I also knew that law was a tool, something that could be interpreted and manipulated by people who understood how to use it. And I was learning how to use it. I began making copies of documents carefully, methodically, using the hours when Jonathan was out inspecting the fields or meeting with other planters. I copied the marriage certificate, the will, the financial records, the correspondence with his lawyers. I hid these copies in various places around the plantation, ensuring that even if one cache was discovered, others would remain safe. I also began documenting everything about our marriage, the dates we'd spent together, the gifts he'd given me, the ways he'd treated me as his wife rather than his property. I kept a journal hidden in a hollowed-out book in the library, where I recorded every detail that might someday be useful in a legal battle, because I knew there would be a legal battle. I knew that when Jonathan died and all men died eventually, his family would try to deny my claim, would try to invalidate the marriage, would try to take everything and leave me with nothing. But I was preparing for that battle. I was building a case that would be impossible to refute, collecting evidence that would prove beyond doubt that Jonathan Harrington had married me, had treated me as his wife, had intended for me to inherit his estate. And I was patient. I'd learned patience over years of slavery, over years of enduring Jonathan's obsession, over years of waiting for my moment. I could wait a little longer. The other slaves watched my transformation with a mixture of envy and suspicion. I was no longer one of them. I lived in the big house. I wore better clothes. I ate better food. I had privileges they could only dream of. Some of them hated me for it, saw me as a traitor who'd abandoned her people for personal comfort. But a few understood. A few saw what I was doing, recognized the long game I was playing. One of them was Elias, an older man who'd been on the plantation for 40 years, who'd seen masters come and go, who'd learned to read the currents of power and survival. He approached me one day while I was in the kitchen, speaking in a low voice that wouldn't carry beyond the room. "You're planning something," he said. It wasn't a question. I looked at him carefully, trying to decide how much to trust him, how much to reveal. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do. You're not just playing house with Master Harrington. You're building something, preparing for something. I've been watching you, and I recognize the look in your eyes. It's the same look I've seen in other people who are planning to fight back." I was silent for a long moment, weighing the risks of honesty against the potential benefits of having an ally. Finally, I said, "If I were planning something, what would you do?" "Help," Elias said simply. "I'm too old to run, too old to fight, but I can watch, I can listen, I can pass information, and when the time comes, I can testify to what I've seen." "Why would you help me?" I asked. "You don't even like me. None of them do. Because you're the only one of us who has a chance," Elias said. "You're inside the big house. You have access to things we'll never see. You have opportunities we'll never have. If you're really planning to fight back, to use your position to hurt Master Harrington and maybe help the rest of us, then I want to be part of it." I studied his face, looking for signs of deception or hidden motives. But I saw only sincerity and a desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, something good could come from my impossible situation. "All right," I said quietly. "I'll tell you what I'm planning, but if you betray me, if you tell anyone what I'm about to say, we'll both die. Do you understand?" "I understand," Elias said. So I told him not everything. I kept some details to myself, some plans that were too dangerous to share. But I told him enough that I was married to Jonathan, that I was documenting everything, that I was preparing to claim his estate when he died, and that if I succeeded, I would use that estate to free every slave on the plantation. Elias's eyes widened as I spoke, and when I finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he smiled, a slow, fierce smile that transformed his weathered face. "You're going to destroy him," he said with satisfaction. "You're going to use his own obsession, his own arrogance to tear down everything he's built. That's beautiful. That's justice. It's revenge," I corrected. "Justice would be if he'd never owned us in the first place. This is just making him pay for what he's done." "Call it what you want," Elias said. "I'll help however I can. And when the time comes, when you need witnesses to testify about your marriage, about how Master Harrington treated you, I'll be there." He kept his word. Over the next few years, Elias became my eyes and ears among the slaves, passing me information about what they were saying, what they were thinking, what they were noticing about my relationship with Jonathan. He also helped me identify other potential allies, slaves who might be willing to testify on my behalf when the time came, who might be willing to risk punishment to help me succeed. Meanwhile, my relationship with Jonathan deepened in ways that made me uncomfortable. He genuinely seemed to love me, or at least to love his idea of me. He was attentive, affectionate, treating me with a respect and consideration that would have been remarkable if it weren't built on years of violence and ownership. "You've changed me," he told me one evening as we sat together in the parlor. "Before you, I was empty, going through the motions of life without really living. But you've given me purpose, given me joy. You've made me a better man. I wanted to laugh at that. Wanted to point out that a better man wouldn't own slaves, wouldn't have branded a 17-year-old girl, wouldn't have raped her for years before deciding to marry her. But I kept my thoughts to myself, smiled, and said what he wanted to hear. "You've changed me too," I said, which was true in ways he didn't understand. I had changed. I'd become harder, more calculating, more focused on my goal. I'd learned to separate my emotions from my actions, to play a role so convincingly that sometimes I almost forgot it was a role. But I never forgot the brand on my shoulder. Every time I dressed, every time I caught a glimpse of myself in a mirror, I saw that scar. The letter H burned into my flesh, the permanent mark of his ownership. And I remembered who I was, what I was doing, and why. The years passed. 1851 became 1852, became 1853. I continued my work, continued collecting evidence, continued preparing for the moment when everything would change. And I watched Jonathan carefully, looking for signs of weakness, of illness, of anything that might indicate his time was running out. In the spring of 1854, I noticed he was coughing more than usual, that he seemed tired, that he was losing weight despite eating normally. He dismissed my concern, said it was just a cold, just the stress of managing the plantation. But I recognized the signs. I'd seen them before in other people, had watched my own mother waste away from the same disease. Jonathan Harrington was dying of consumption. He probably had a year, maybe two, if he was lucky. My moment was coming. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd endured, everything I'd planned, it was all about to come to fruition. I just had to be patient a little longer. I just had to keep playing my role, keep being the devoted wife, keep waiting for the moment when I could reveal the truth and claim what was rightfully mine. The brand on my shoulder throbbed as I lay beside my dying husband that night, a reminder of where I'd come from and where I was going, from slave to wife to widow to owner. It was an impossible journey, but I was going to complete it. And when I did, Jonathan Harrington's legacy wouldn't be the plantation he'd built or the wealth he'd accumulated. It would be the woman he'd branded, the woman he'd married, the woman who would use his own obsession to destroy everything he'd created and free everyone he'd enslaved. Justice was coming, and it wore the face of the slave woman he'd thought he could own. Jonathan's illness progressed slowly over the next year, giving me time to perfect my preparations. By the summer of 1854, his coughing had become constant, his weight loss dramatic, his energy depleted. The doctors came and went, prescribing various treatments that did nothing to slow the consumption eating away at his lungs. "I'm dying," he told me one night, his voice weak and raspy. "We both know it. I need to update my will, need to make sure you're provided for." This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the opportunity to ensure that my legal claim would be unassailable. "What did you have in mind?" I asked carefully. "I'll leave you a sum of money," Jonathan said, "enough to live comfortably for the rest of your life, and I'll include a provision freeing you, making you legally free so you won't be considered property after I'm gone." It was a generous offer by the standards of the time. Many masters left nothing to their slave mistresses, and the idea of freeing me was more than most would consider. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't nearly enough. "What about the plantation?" I asked. "What about your estate?" "That will go to my cousin Edmund, as specified in my current will. He'll inherit the land, the slaves, everything. But I'll make sure he knows to treat you well, to respect your position." I felt anger rising in my chest, but forced it down, kept my voice calm and reasonable. "Jonathan, I'm your wife. Under Virginia law, I'm entitled to at least 1/3 of your estate, possibly more. You can't just leave me a sum of money and expect me to be grateful." He looked uncomfortable, shifting in the bed. "Sarah, you know our marriage isn't conventional. It's not publicly recognized. If I try to leave you a significant portion of my estate, Edmund will challenge it. He'll claim the marriage was invalid. He'll tie everything up in legal battles that could last for years. Let him challenge it, I said firmly. I have the marriage certificate. I have documentation of our relationship. I have witnesses who can testify that you treated me as your wife. I have everything I need to prove my claim. You've been planning this, Jonathan said slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. All this time, you've been preparing for a legal battle. Of course I have, I said, dropping the pretense of the devoted wife for the first time in years. Did you think I would just accept whatever scraps you decided to leave me? Did you think I would be grateful for your generosity after everything you've done to me? He stared at me, and I saw hurt and betrayal in his expression. I thought you loved me. I thought we'd built something real together. You branded me, I said, pulling down my dress to expose the scar on my shoulder. The letter H that he'd burned into my flesh 12 years earlier. You raped me for years. You owned me like property. And now you're surprised that I'm not content to be your grateful mistress? You're surprised that I want what's legally mine. I was trying to make up for that, Jonathan said weakly. I was trying to show you that I'd changed, that I loved you. You can't make up for it, I said coldly. You can't erase what you did with gifts and affection and a secret marriage. But you can give me what I'm owed. You can rewrite your will to leave me half of your estate, not as a gift, but as my legal right as your wife. If I do that, Edmund will destroy you, Jonathan warned. He'll challenge the marriage, will claim you manipulated me, will use every legal trick he can find to take everything from you. You'll spend years in court, and you might lose everything. Then I'll lose everything, I said. But at least I'll have fought. At least I'll have tried to claim what's mine instead of accepting whatever scraps you decided to throw me. We argued for hours that night. Jonathan trying to convince me to accept a smaller settlement, me insisting on my full legal rights as his wife. Finally, exhausted and weakened by his illness, he agreed. All right, he said, I'll rewrite the will. I'll leave you half of everything, the land, the assets, the slaves. But I'm also going to include provisions that will make it harder for Edmund to challenge. I'll have multiple witnesses. I'll have my lawyers draft it carefully. I'll make it as legally sound as possible. Good, I said. And I want one more thing. I want you to acknowledge our marriage publicly before you die. I want you to tell people, your lawyers, your friends, anyone who will listen that I'm your wife, that you married me legally, that you intend for me to inherit. That will destroy my reputation, Jonathan said. It will make me a pariah, will turn everyone against me. You're dying, I pointed out. What do you care about your reputation? You'll be dead, and I'll be the one dealing with the consequences. The least you can do is make my legal battle easier by acknowledging the truth before you're gone. He agreed, though reluctantly, and over the next few months, as his health continued to decline, he began telling people about our marriage. His lawyers were shocked, his friends were scandalized, and the news spread through Virginia Plantation society like wildfire. Jonathan Harrington had married his slave, had made her his legal wife, had intended to leave her half of his estate. The reaction was exactly what I'd expected: outrage, disgust, condemnation. Jonathan was denounced as a race traitor, as a man who'd betrayed his class and his heritage. His cousin Edmund began making threats, promising to challenge the will, to prove the marriage was invalid, to ensure that I wouldn't inherit a single penny. But I was ready for all of it. I had my documentation, my witnesses, my carefully constructed legal case. And I had something else: the moral high ground. Because no matter how much society condemned interracial marriage, no matter how much they hated the idea of a former slave inheriting a plantation, they couldn't deny that I had been Jonathan's wife, that he had chosen to marry me, that under the law, however uncomfortable, it made them my had rights. Elias and the other slaves I'd recruited as allies began spreading their own version of the story among the black community, both enslaved and free. They talked about how I'd been branded, how I'd been raped, how I'd endured years of abuse before being elevated to wife. They talked about how I was planning to free all the slaves on the plantation if I inherited, how I was going to use Jonathan's wealth to fight against the institution that had created us both. The story took on a life of its own, spreading beyond Virginia, reaching abolitionists in the North who saw in my case a powerful symbol of resistance and survival. Newspapers began covering the story. Some condemned me as a scheming temptress who'd manipulated a dying man. Others praised me as a hero who turned the tools of oppression against her oppressor. And through it all, I continued my work. I continued documenting everything, continued gathering evidence, continued preparing for the legal battle that would begin the moment Jonathan died. He lasted longer than the doctors expected. Consumption was unpredictable, sometimes killing quickly, sometimes dragging out for years. But by the spring of 1855, it was clear he had only weeks left. He was bedridden, barely able to breathe, coughing up blood, his body wasted to almost nothing. "I'm sorry," he told me one of the last times he was lucid enough to speak. "I'm sorry for everything I did to you. I know you don't believe me. I know you think this is all just manipulation and strategy, but I really do love you, Sarah. And I hope that someday you'll be able to forgive me." I looked at him, this man who'd owned me, who'd branded me, who'd raped me, who'd married me, who was now dying and asking for forgiveness, and I felt nothing. No love, no hate, no pity, no satisfaction, just a cold emptiness where emotions should have been. "I'll never forgive you," I said quietly, "but I'll use what you've given me to do something good. I'll free the people you enslaved. I'll destroy the system you benefited from, and maybe that will be enough. Maybe that will be justice." He died 3 days later on a warm May morning with me sitting beside his bed. His last words were, "I love you." And I said nothing in response, just watched as he took his final breath and became still. Jonathan Harrington was dead, and the real battle was about to begin. The funeral was a small, uncomfortable affair. Few of Jonathan's former friends attended, unwilling to be associated with a man who'd married his slave. His cousin Edmund was there, glaring at me with undisguised hatred, clearly already planning his legal challenge. The will was read 3 days after the funeral in the office of Jonathan's lawyer, a nervous man named Mr. Peyton, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Edmund was there, along with his own lawyer. I was there wearing black mourning clothes, my face carefully neutral. Mr. Peyton cleared his throat and began reading. "I, Jonathan Harrington, being of sound mind and body, do hereby make this my last will and testament. To my beloved wife, Sarah Harrington, I leave half of my estate, including half of the plantation land, half of the financial assets, and half of the property therein." "This is outrageous," Edmund interrupted. "That woman is not his wife. The marriage was illegal, invalid. A fraud perpetrated by a scheming slave who manipulated a dying man. The marriage was legal," Mr. Peyton said firmly. "I have the certificate signed by Father Mallory and witnessed by 2 individuals. I have documentation of Mr. Harrington's acknowledgement of the marriage. And I have Mr. Harrington's explicit instructions that his wife was to inherit half of his estate." "I'll challenge this," Edmund said. "I'll take it to court. I'll prove the marriage was invalid. I'll ensure that this woman doesn't inherit a single penny of my cousin's estate." "That is your right," Mr. Peyton said. "But I should warn you that Mrs. Harrington has extensive documentation supporting her claim. This will not be an easy case to win." Edmund turned to me, his face red with rage. "You think you're clever, don't you? You think you've won, but I'll destroy you. I'll drag you through every court in Virginia. I'll expose you as the manipulative underscore you are. I'll make sure everyone knows what you really are." I met his eyes calmly. "I'm Jonathan Harrington's widow. I'm the woman he chose to marry. The woman he chose to leave half his estate to. And I'm the woman who's going to use that estate to free every slave on this plantation and destroy everything you people have built on the backs of human suffering." So yes, Mr. Harrington, I do think I've won. And there's nothing you can do to stop me. The legal battle had begun, and I was ready for it. The lawsuit that Edmund Harrington filed against me in the summer of 1855 was titled Harrington versus Harrington, Contest of Will and Challenge to Marriage Validity. It became the most sensational legal case in Virginia history, a scandal that dominated newspapers and dinner conversations across the South. Edmund's legal strategy was straightforward: prove that my marriage to Jonathan was invalid, thereby invalidating my claim to his estate. His lawyers argued that interracial marriage was illegal in Virginia, that the ceremony performed by Father Mallory had no legal standing, that I had manipulated and coerced a dying man into changing his will, and that, as a former slave, I had no legal capacity to enter into a marriage contract in the first place. My legal team, assembled with money I'd saved over the years and with help from abolitionist organizations in the North, countered with a more complex argument. Yes, interracial marriage was illegal in Virginia, but the marriage had been performed by a licensed priest. It's been documented with a legal certificate and had been acknowledged by Jonathan both privately and publicly before his death. More importantly, Jonathan had treated me as his wife in every meaningful way. I had lived in his house, managed his household, been introduced to his associates as his wife, and been provided for in his will, as a wife would be. The question before this court, my lead attorney, a brilliant black lawyer from Boston named Theodore Wright, argued, is not whether the marriage was conventional or socially acceptable. The question is whether it was legal. And, under the laws of Virginia, a marriage performed by a licensed religious official and acknowledged by both parties is valid regardless of the race of those parties. That's absurd, Edmund's lawyer, a pompous man named Bogard Thornton, countered. The law clearly prohibits interracial marriage. The legislature never intended for such unions to be recognized. Regardless of the technicalities of how they were performed, then the legislature should have been more careful in how they wrote the law, Wright replied. As it stands, there is no provision in Virginia law that explicitly invalidates a marriage performed by a licensed priest simply because the parties are of different races. The law prohibits such marriages from being performed, yes, but it does not specify what happens when such a marriage is performed anyway. That ambiguity works in my client's favor. The trial began in September of 1855 in a courtroom packed with spectators, journalists, and curious onlookers. I sat at the plaintiff's table in a simple but elegant black dress, my hands folded calmly in my lap, my face showing none of the anxiety I felt inside. The first week of the trial focused on establishing the facts of the marriage. Wright called Father Mallory to the stand, and the priest, clearly uncomfortable but legally compelled to testify, confirmed that he had performed a marriage ceremony between Jonathan Harrington and myself in 1851. Was the ceremony legally valid? Wright asked. I performed it according to the rites of the Catholic Church, Father Mallory said. I signed the certificate. I witnessed the vows. By the standards of the Church, it was a valid marriage. And did Mr. Harrington pay you to perform this ceremony? He forgave a debt I owed him in exchange for performing the ceremony. So he bribed you. Thornton interjected during cross-examination. He paid you to perform an illegal ceremony to create a fraudulent document that he could use to circumvent the law. I performed a religious ceremony, Father Mallory said defensively. Whether it was legal under state law is not for me to determine. The second week focused on Jonathan's treatment of me as his wife. Wright called a parade of witnesses, household slaves, business associates, neighbors who testified that Jonathan had introduced me as his wife, had treated me with the respect and consideration due to a wife, had made it clear that he considered our marriage legitimate. Elias was one of the witnesses, and his testimony was particularly powerful. I worked on the Harrington Plantation for 40 years, he said, his voice strong and clear despite his age. I saw Master Harrington with his first wife, Mrs. Victoria, and I saw how he treated Sarah after they married. He treated her the same way, with respect, with affection, as his partner and companion. Whatever the law says, in his mind and in his heart, she was his wife. But she was also his slave, Thornton pointed out during cross-examination. She was his property. How can a man marry his own property? He freed her before the marriage, Elias said, which was a lie, but it was a lie we'd agreed upon. A necessary fiction to strengthen my legal case. He gave her manumission papers, made her a free woman, and then married her. Do you have these manumission papers? Thornton demanded. They were destroyed in a fire. Wright interjected smoothly. But we have testimony from multiple witnesses that Mrs. Harrington was treated as a free woman from 1851 onward. That she was paid for her work as housekeeper. That she had freedom of movement and decision-making that no slave would have possessed. It was a risky strategy, building part of our case on documents that didn't exist. But it was necessary, because the alternative, meaning that I'd been a slave when Jonathan married me, would have made the marriage even more legally questionable. The third week focused on the will itself. Wright argued that Jonathan had been of sound mind when he wrote it. That he had clearly intended for me to inherit half his estate, that he had taken steps to ensure the will would be legally sound and difficult to challenge. Mr. Harrington knew his family would object to his marriage, Wright told the jury. He knew they would try to invalidate his will to deny his wife her rightful inheritance. That's why he was so careful in how he structured the will, why he had multiple witnesses, why he made his intentions explicitly clear. He wanted to ensure that his wife would be provided for after his death. Thornton countered, he was a dying man. Weakened by illness, manipulated by a scheming woman who saw an opportunity to enrich herself at his family's expense. The fact that he changed his will so dramatically in the final months of his life, leaving half his estate to a former slave he'd only recently married, suggests undue influence and possible coercion. The trial dragged on for 6 weeks, with both sides presenting evidence, calling witnesses, making arguments. The newspapers covered every detail, with Northern papers generally sympathetic to my case, and Southern papers condemning me as a gold digger and a race traitor. But something unexpected happened as the trial progressed. Public opinion began to shift in my favor. Not among the plantation elite who remained uniformly hostile, but among ordinary people, poor whites, free blacks, even some slaves who managed to hear about the case. There was a growing sense that I deserved to win, that I had earned my inheritance through years of suffering. That justice demanded I be given what Jonathan had promised me. Part of this shift was due to the revelation of the brand on my shoulder. During my testimony, Wright asked me to show the jury the scar that Jonathan had burned into my flesh when I was 17. "Mrs. Harrington," he said gently, "would you please show the jury the mark that Mr. Jonathan Harrington placed on your body?" I stood, turned my back to the jury, and pulled down my dress to expose my shoulder. The courtroom went silent as they saw the raised, ugly scar, the letter H burned into my flesh, a permanent mark of ownership and violence. "Mr. Harrington branded you," Wright said, his voice heavy with emotion. "He marked you like an animal, claimed you as his property. And yet, years later, he married you, made you his wife, left you half his estate. Why do you think he did that?" "Because he felt guilty," I said quietly. "Because he knew what he'd done to me was wrong, and he wanted to make amends. He couldn't undo the past. Couldn't erase this scar. But he could try to give me a future, could try to provide for me, could try to make up for the years of suffering he'd caused. And do you believe he succeeded in making amends?" "No," I said honestly. "Nothing he did could make up for what he took from me, my freedom, my dignity, my youth. But he tried, and I'm grateful for that, even if it's not enough." The image of that scar, described in vivid detail in newspaper accounts, became a symbol of the case. It was impossible to look at that brand and not understand the power dynamic that had existed between Jonathan and me. Impossible to deny that I had been a victim long before I became a wife. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, the foreman stood and read the verdict in a voice that shook slightly. We find in favor of the plaintiff, Mrs. Sarah Harrington. We find that her marriage to Mr. Jonathan Harrington was legally valid, that she is entitled to inherit under the terms of his will, and that she should receive half of his estate as specified in that will. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Cheers from my supporters. Outraged shouts from Edmund and his allies. The judge banging his gavel and calling for order. I sat frozen, barely able to believe that we'd won, that the impossible had happened, that Aja, former slave, a branded woman, a person who'd been property just 4 years earlier, had successfully claimed half of a major Virginia plantation. But even as I celebrated, I knew this wasn't over. Edmund would appeal, would take the case to higher courts, would fight with every resource he had to overturn the verdict. The battle was far from finished. Still, we'd won the first round, and that was something. Edmund Harrington filed his appeal within days of the verdict, and the case moved to the Virginia Supreme Court. But while the legal battle continued, the trial court's decision stood, which meant I had immediate access to half of Jonathan's estate. I used that access to do exactly what I'd promised. I freed every slave on the Harrington plantation. It happened on a cold November morning in 1855, 6 months after Jonathan's death. I gathered all 132 slaves in the yard in front of the big house, the same yard where I'd been whipped, where I'd been branded, where I'd suffered so much over the years. "You're free," I told them, my voice carrying across the silent crowd. "All of you. I'm signing manumission papers for every person on this plantation. You're no longer property. You're no longer slaves. You're free human beings, and you can go wherever you want. Do whatever you want. Be whoever you want." The silence that followed was profound. They stared at me, unable to process what I'd just said, unable to believe that freedom could come so suddenly, so completely. "Some of you hate me," I continued. "You think I betrayed you by becoming Master Harrington's wife? By living in the big house while you suffered in the quarters? And maybe you're right. Maybe I did betray you. But I did it for this moment, for this opportunity to free all of you. Everything I endured, everything I sacrificed, it was all for this." Elias stepped forward, tears streaming down his weathered face. "You did it," he said. "You actually did it. You freed us all." "I freed you legally," I corrected. "But you're not truly free until you leave this place, until you build new lives somewhere else. Virginia is still a slave state. You're still in danger here, so I'm giving each of you money enough to travel north, enough to start over, enough to have a chance at a real life." Over the next few weeks, the freed slaves left the plantation in small groups, heading north toward states where slavery was illegal, toward cities where they might find work and safety. Some went to Boston, some to New York, some to Canada. A few stayed in Virginia, taking their chances in a state that was hostile to free black people, but was still home. Elias stayed with me, helping me manage the transition, helping me prepare for the next phase of my plan. Because freeing the slaves was only the first step. The second step was selling the plantation and using the money to fund the Underground Railroad and other abolitionist causes. Edmund's appeal was heard by the Virginia Supreme Court in the spring of 1856. His lawyers argued that the trial court had erred, that interracial marriage was clearly illegal in Virginia, that the jury had been swayed by emotion rather than law, that the verdict should be overturned, and the estate awarded to Edmund as Jonathan's rightful heir. My lawyers countered that the trial court had correctly applied the law, that the marriage was valid despite being unconventional, that I had proven my case beyond reasonable doubt. The Supreme Court took 6 months to issue its decision. When it came in the fall of 1856, it was a compromise that satisfied no one. The trial court erred in finding that the marriage between Jonathan Harrington and Sarah Harrington was legally valid. Interracial marriage is prohibited in Virginia, and such prohibition extends to marriages performed by religious officials. However, the trial court correctly found that Mr. Harrington intended for Mrs. Harrington to inherit a portion of his estate and that she was entitled to some compensation for her years of service to him. Therefore, we modify the verdict as follows. Mrs. Harrington is entitled to 1/4 of the estate, not 1/2. The remaining 3/4 shall pass to Edmund Harrington as the rightful heir. It was a partial victory, a compromise that gave me less than I'd won at trial, but more than Edmund had wanted me to have. I would inherit 1/4 of the plantation, still a substantial sum, still enough to accomplish my goals, but not the complete victory I'd hoped for. Edmund was furious, having expected the Supreme Court to overturn the verdict entirely. I was disappointed, but pragmatic. 1/4 of the estate was still worth approximately $65,000, a fortune by any standard, more money than most people would see in a lifetime. And it was enough to fund my plans, enough to make a difference, enough to transform my suffering into something meaningful. I sold my portion of the plantation to a buyer from South Carolina, a man who planned to continue operating it as a cotton plantation with slave labor. It made me sick to sell the land to someone who would perpetuate the system I'd fought against. But I needed the money, and I needed it quickly before Edmund could find some way to tie up the estate in further legal challenges. With the $65,000 from the sale, I did exactly what I'd promised. I funded the Underground Railroad, providing money for safe houses, transportation, and supplies for escaped slaves making their way north. I donated to abolitionist organizations, to schools for free black children, to legal defense funds for fugitive slaves. And I became a symbol of the slave woman who'd married her master, who'd used his own obsession to claim his estate, who'd freed 132 people and used her inheritance to fight against slavery itself. The brand on my shoulder, which had once been a mark of shame and ownership, became a symbol of resistance. Abolitionists used my story in their speeches and pamphlets, pointing to me as proof that slaves were capable of strategic thinking, of long-term planning, of using the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. Sarah Harrington was branded like an animal, Frederick Douglass wrote in his newspaper. But she transformed that brand into a badge of honor, a reminder that even the most oppressed can fight back, can claim their dignity, can turn the weapons of their oppressors against them. Her story is a testament to the indomitable spirit of enslaved people, to the power of patience and strategy, to the possibility of justice even in the most unjust systems. I lived the rest of my life in Boston in a modest house purchased with a small portion of my inheritance. I never remarried, never had children, never tried to build a conventional life. I'd spent too many years playing roles, pretending to be something I wasn't, sacrificing my authentic self for strategic purposes. In freedom, I wanted only to be myself. Sarah, the woman who'd survived slavery, who'd married her master, who'd claimed his estate and used it to free others. Elias lived with me until his death in 1863, serving not as a servant, but as a friend and companion. We spent our evenings talking about the plantation, about the people we'd known, about the strange journey that had brought us from slavery to freedom. "Do you regret it, Ellie?" he asked me one night a few months before he died. "Do you regret marrying him, enduring all those years, sacrificing so much for this?" I thought about the question carefully. I thought about the 17-year-old girl who'd been branded, about the years of rape and exploitation, about the role I'd played as Jonathan's wife, about the price I'd paid for my revenge. "No," I said finally. "I don't regret it. I wish it hadn't been necessary. Wish I could have found another way to fight back. But given the circumstances, given the options I had, I made the right choice. I survived. I freed 132 people, and I used Jonathan's wealth to fight against the system that created us both. That's worth something. That's worth everything I endured." Elias nodded, satisfied. "You're a hero, Sarah. You might not think of yourself that way, but that's what you are. You fought back in the only way you could, and you won. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a survivor, like someone who'd done what was necessary to endure and to help others endure. But if my story could inspire other enslaved people, if it could give them hope that resistance was possible, that the system could be fought and sometimes beaten, then maybe Elias was right. Maybe I was a hero after all. I died in 1892 at the age of 67, having lived to see the end of slavery, the Civil War, and the beginning of Reconstruction. The brand on my shoulder, the letter H that Jonathan Harrington had burned into my flesh 50 years earlier, was still visible, a permanent reminder of where I'd come from and what I'd overcome. They buried me in a cemetery in Boston, and my gravestone read simply, Sarah Harrington, 1825 to 1892. She was branded, but she was never broken. It was the truth. Jonathan Harrington had tried to own me, had marked me as his property, had used me for his pleasure and his comfort, but he'd never broken me, never destroyed the core of who I was, never extinguished the fire that burned inside me. And in the end, I'd used his own obsession, his own arrogance, his own belief that he could transform rape into love and ownership into marriage to destroy him and everything he'd built. The slave woman he branded became his wife, became his widow, became the owner of his estate, and became the liberator of everyone he'd enslaved. It was the ultimate revenge, the perfect justice, the transformation of suffering into triumph. And the brand on my shoulder, that permanent mark of his ownership, became a symbol not of his power over me, but of my power over him. It became a reminder that even the most oppressed can fight back, can claim their dignity, can turn the weapons of their oppressors against them. Jonathan Harrington thought he was honoring me by making me his wife. But he was actually giving me the tools I needed to destroy his legacy and free his slaves. He married the woman he'd branded, and he regretted it for the rest of his life. This was the story of Sarah Harrington, who was branded as a slave at age 17 and became the wife of her master 10 years later. She successfully claimed 1/4 of his estate after his death in 1855, despite legal challenges from his family. She used her inheritance to free 132 slaves and to fund abolitionist causes, becoming a symbol of resistance and strategic survival. The legal case of Harrington versus Harrington became one of the most controversial in Virginia history, with the Virginia Supreme Court's compromise decision setting precedents for property rights and marriage law that would be debated for decades. Sarah lived in Boston until her death in 1892, never remarrying and dedicating her life to supporting formerly enslaved people and fighting against slavery. The brand on her shoulder, which had been intended as a mark of ownership and punishment, became a symbol of resistance that was referenced in abolitionist literature and speeches throughout the 1850s. Her story inspired other enslaved people to resist strategically, to use the master's tools against him, and to believe that even the most oppressed could fight back and win. She is buried in Mount Auburn Cemetery in Boston, and her gravestone remains a pilgrimage site for those interested in the history of slavery and resistance. The echoes of Sarah's extraordinary transformation reverberate through time, a searing reminder that the most powerful revenge is not violence, but the strategic use of the oppressor's own tools against them. From branded slave to legal wife to liberator of 132 souls, Sarah's journey exposes the darkest hypocrisies of slavery. The masters who raped their slaves and called it love, who branded human beings and then married them, who built fortunes on stolen labor and stolen lives. Her story proves that resistance takes many forms. Sometimes it's escape, sometimes it's rebellion, and sometimes it's the patient, strategic accumulation of power until the moment comes to strike. The brand on her shoulder, meant to mark her as property forever, became instead a symbol of her triumph, a permanent reminder that even the most brutal attempts to break the human spirit can be transformed into weapons of liberation. If these untold stories of strategic brilliance and long-game vengeance from America's hidden history resonate with you, Hit that like button and subscribe for more eye-opening tales of resilience and rebellion. Drop a comment below what shocked you most about Sarah's story. Her unyielding patience, her mastermind strategy, or the sheer scale of her liberation. Let me know which forgotten chapter of resistance you'd like to uncover next, and I'll see you in the next video.